Welcome to Tigrai Media House. My name is Maliti Berhana-Meskel. It has been 21 months since the war on Tigray began, and a complete siege has been put on the people of Tigray. This war has been described as the world's most deadliest war, and it's being done in the dark. Quite literally, there's still no electricity. There is still no communication in the state of Tigray. There is still no phone lines in the state of Tigray. Journalists have been removed and are still not allowed into Tigray to report on what is happening on the ground, in spite of invitations by the government of Tigray to do so. Access has been limited. We know that there's not enough food in the state. People are dying of starvation. People are dying from lack of medicine. In spite of pictures being posted of aid trucks coming into the state of Tigray, we know that it can be compared to using a water gun to put out a fire. There is not enough aid going into the state of Tigray to aid the people. A recent number that we heard in terms of the number of deaths in Tigray was 500,000, 500,000. That was given earlier this year. Again, because there is no one on the ground to give us information, this number is an estimate, and it comes from some people who are researchers who are working very hard to shine a light on this very dark situation. One of those leading researchers is my guest today, Emnet Negash. He's a doctoral student and researcher at the University of Ghent. He was also a professor at Mekelle University. His expertise is expansive and includes topoclimatology, hydrology, farming systems, and GIS systems. Emnet, we're so excited to have you with us today. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me, Melita.
So, Emnet, the researchers, including yourself at Ghent University, have been at the forefront of capturing the war on Tigray in quantitative data, which has been really challenging because, again, no one is on the ground. There's a lack of information coming out of the state of Tigray. So can you talk about how you started collecting this data and the tools that you've used to gather information in spite of a complete communication blackout?
All that we have done so far is we believe we only did, and we are only doing the least we can do, and we are only trying to dedicate ourselves to serve the victims. And all the information we try to get, the way we started is we started by giving an early warning service, like that a famine is upcoming, and we continued in towards looking at the humanitarian situation and mainly looking at the farming systems, looking to professionally look at what is coming up and what is actually happening and what is anticipated and all that. And for this, we base ourselves based on the little information that comes up via personal contact, and sometimes when there is a telephone service for limited areas when it was there. And otherwise, we could only use satellite imageries to get first-hand information, or maybe to verify claims from any source. Apart from that, any information we have so far, and we might have published so far, is very limited and the tip of the iceberg if we compare it to the situation on the ground.
So I've looked at a lot of the research that you've published and a lot of the essays that you've written, and I was really surprised or intrigued by the maps that you have. And you have this site called Tigray Atlas of the Humanitarian Situation, and you visualize everything for us. So everything from like rainfall and aid distribution, massacre sites, civilian deaths. In particular, that heat map of civilian deaths was really telling. So the number that you all released of 500,000 people who died, that number really shook the international community when that first came out. How did you arrive at that estimate? And I'm curious because I believe that number was released earlier this year. How has that number changed or increased in terms of, the inaction daily? What is the impact of that?
Yes, okay. On the map, on the Tigray Atlas of the humanitarian situation, we try to provide as much information as possible to also give, not only to report what is happening, but also to give some context to the readers. So for that, we include the rainfall, the land use, the roughness of the surface, the population, and all that, and including the aid distribution and everything. And since you mentioned the heat map it shows the civilian casualties, the fully documented civilian casualties, and the massacres, which we have documented so far for about 283 massacre incidents, which our colleague team is working on that. And if you look at the fully documented civilian casualties, about 50% of them are on the productive age group, which is between the age of 20 to 60. And you can tell what it means, not only for the loss of life that we are having now, but also for the future, for the upcoming impacts. Mm-hmm. And part of that is only, like I said, we have the communication blackout, and every information that we have is limited, only the tip of the iceberg. And it's not full. And for that, we had to come up with the estimate of about 500,000 people which might have possibly died over the last a year and a half to 2 years. And that includes the direct killings, the possible deaths from lack of medical care, and the possible deaths from starvation. And if I start from the direct killings, so what we have documented so far is nearly about 10,000. That is confirmed number. But then in many areas where it has not been possible to report from, to have any information leaking, including the areas bordering Eritrea and many parts of the central Tigray, and Western Tigray remains a black spot where we don't have any bit of information about. So we think the number we have is very conservative and limited, and for that we think it would be between 50 and 100,000. And the other one we have is the possible deaths from lack of medical care, where people are not only sick, but no supply and all that, but the health infrastructure by itself has been largely destroyed. We have several publications from the Lancet where some colleagues have published already, and report from the Bureau of Health for Tigray, where they say much of about 80% of the medical care infrastructure has been destroyed. So the general estimate is that we are now back to the level of 1980s for the medical infrastructure, where there has not been modern healthcare infrastructure. And by then, the days was about 20 people from 1,000 would die from lack of medical care. 20 from 1,000 people in need of medical care. And now we are having about 3.9 million in need of medical care. And before the war started, the days was about 10 to 12 people for 1,000 in need of medical care. So if we are now back to 1980s, then on top of that, we have no delivery of the necessary public health services like the medicine and medical equipment and all that. And in the absence of this, the rate would be 20 to 32 people from 1,000 would die from lack of medical care. And that would give that estimate of over 100,000 people who might have possibly died from lack of medical care. And the other estimate we have is for lack of food, which is starvation. And we may remember the estimate by June from IPC that about 350,000 people are possibly facing famine. And later in July, we have the same estimate of for about 400,000 people who are likely facing famine. And next to that, in July, we also had that estimate from the USAID, about 900,000 people are possibly facing famine. And following up from there, about 1.6 million were likely facing famine, according to the report from Tigray again. So if you consider these numbers, then famine means about 2 people from 10,000 would die daily, 2 from 10,000. And that would give us about 150,000 to 200 100,000 people possibly dying from lack of food, which is starvation. And if you add up these three, it would give us about 500,000 people dying, who might have possibly died over the last 1.5 or 2 years, possibly. And now this number, for us, it will continue. We believe, I personally believe, it would continue for as long as food aid and medical care are not being delivered to Tigray. And it's really frustrating.
Wow. So you said a few things that I just want to point out. So you said of these are civilian casualties, this is not combat casualties, right? These are all civilian casualties that we're talking about. Is that right?
Not at all. Yes, all of them civilian casualties. The direct killings, all of them, 50 to 100,000 would be civilians, and those dying from lack of medical care and starvation would also be civilians, and no combatant is involved in these statistics.
Okay. The other thing you said is about half of the people who have been killed, the civilian casualties, are between the ages of 20 and 60. What does that mean for a society moving forward if your entire middle generation is gone? You're then left with a society of extremely young and extremely old. What does that mean for societies? We've seen this in other countries, by the way, in other African countries. But what does that mean? Can you go into that a little bit?
That is the point where it frustrates me the most, and I'm left speechless. And I really don't have words to talk about this unless I have to research further about it.
Right. It seems like you're left with two populations that are not as strong, right? You have children you have to take care of, and then elders, but that whole middle population is completely gone. It's a very scary notion to think about. The other thing that you said that I want to clarify is this number does not include estimates from Western Tigray because there is no information there. Is that accurate?
Not really. We have included the reports that we have from there, and in our estimation, we are taking that whole Tigray, but it still would not be accurate. It's only estimate because that's the only thing we can do for now. But we are trying to do for the entire Tigray, not excluding it at all.
So when I was in Sudan, I went in January with Tigray Media House last year. I interviewed a number of people from Western Tigray, and I'll never forget one of the elders who I interviewed said 500,000 people are missing in Western Tigray. They're gone. Where did they go? So it's a scary notion to think that, I mean, we're talking about 500,000 across the entire Tigray, but residents directly from that town are giving us far greater numbers, and they have lists and lists and lists of people who were killed in Tigray, in Western Tigray specifically, that they saw themselves. It's really devastating. So you said 2 deaths per 10,000 people daily is how famine is measured, right? So what does that mean daily? For every day that we're not addressing this, can you quantify how many deaths that translates to, given the population of Tigray? Do you know that number?
That would not be from the entire population of Tigray. That counts from the population in need of food. So it would mean for June, for instance, it would mean we would calculate it from the people in need of urgent food supply. That is 350,000, and it goes like that. And in July, for instance, we have that estimate from the USAID that was about 900,000, and later in around September, October, we had that estimate from Tigray was about 1.6 million. So it's from that number who are in need, and the same is true for those who are possibly dying from lack of medical care. About 3.9 million who are believed to be in need of medical support, and not from the total population.
Got it. That seems like the number dying from lack of medical care is equal to or even greater than those dying of starvation right now. Is that accurate, or is it pretty based on the numbers?
Our estimation gives about 100,000, more than 100,000. So it's still an estimate and not accurate but the Ethiopian government has not contested it yet.
Wow. And those are preventable deaths, obviously. If medication and food could get into the region, these are preventable. Wow. We are mostly aware of the human rights reports that documented some of the larger massacres, like the Oxum Massacre, where the number, even there, though, again, is an estimate. We've heard 700, but we've heard into the thousands in terms of the number of people who were killed in that massacre. We are aware of Mariam Dingalet got a lot of attention. A lot of these because the human rights groups around the world did reports about these specific massacres. However, you report, I think you said just a minute ago on the show, 280 massacres throughout the state of Tigray. So, which is higher than I had. I thought it was slightly less than that, 280. So how do you define a massacre? First of all, I think that's an important definition. And besides the sheer number of massacres, which is what shocks me, what shocked you most about the data you've been able to collect on these massacres? And also, what areas of Tigray are you seeing most of these massacres? What information can you share about that 280 massacres?
For the definition, by massacre, we are referring to 5 days in the same location, in the same incident by the same day. So 5 people, if 5 people are killed, maybe 5 or more people are being killed in the same spot, in the same day, then we are calling it a massacre, which is a definition we are trying to adopt from the Armenian genocide. So the number would vary. For instance, in one location, you would have 5 people being killed, then you have one massacre. If you have it another killing tomorrow or the day after, then it would be a second massacre in the same spot. But the number in Tigray has been mostly above that, with the highest in Aksum, where we have had more than 800 people killed in the same incident. The number really varies, and so about 283 massacres documented so far. That's a lot and shocking. And what shocks me the most is that we are getting used to this. In normal times, if you hear one person or maybe 2 people or maybe 3 or 5 people died from a car accident, we will be shocked for the coming days or maybe traumatized for a week or so. But now that we have these about 280 something massacres and about 10,000 people confirmed of killing, and an estimate of about 500,000 killed has become the new normal. And this is another level of shocking, and I'm left speechless by that.
I agree. I think we've become desensitized because the crimes have been so great and there have been so many crimes. And before you can even fully accept or absorb what happened, there's the next massacre that happens or the next travesty. So I think you're right. I think we're becoming desensitized, and that's a very scary thing. Even with the images of people dying of starvation, there have been many, many images that have come out, and the reaction is not equal to what we're seeing. It's really scary. I want to shift a little bit to food. There's a story told about Tigrayans that we're unable to feed ourselves. It's a trope that's used over and over again to say our land is dry, that there is no food. It's an attempt to dehumanize Tigrayans, essentially. And that story leaves out really important information in terms of how war devastates our economies, or even in this particular genocide, how Eritrean soldiers specifically were burning farmlands. There was an intentional destruction of food sources for the people of Tigray. So I'm interested in what you've been able to understand or information you've gathered about the impact of this war on crops, on missing planting and harvest seasons, lack of tools. A lot of the tools were stolen as well and looted over the past year and a half. Lack of seeds, I know that was a big deal. So can you talk a little bit about the impact on food and on crops and on farmers?
Yes, and very importantly, not only the enemies that we have on the ground, but I think the international community by itself was also complicit about it. Not just the international community, but the human rights and humanitarian organizations as well. And this is exactly why I think providing farm inputs, the essential farm inputs, including fertilizer and selected seeds, was more important than planning to deliver food aid in the coming November. And that would make the people to develop a self-reliance, so that they produce their own food and they are not aid-reliant society. And if the people were incapable of doing that, and why can't the international community force with all the levers they have to the Ethiopian government and Eritrea and all those perpetrators to have the lands open, have access to their land, and to allow them to properly plow it, produce food. And this is why I say I have always been advocating and saying providing the necessary farm inputs, including seeds and fertilizer in June, is more important than planning to deliver aid in November and December, because that food would be produced harvested in November and December, and they will be able to feed themselves and their family, and not waiting and not reliant on aid. And if you count, for instance, in 2020, about 90% of the production has been destroyed in different means. At first, there was locusts took it, about 25% of it, the rest of it was burned, and the remaining was looted. And totally, about 90% of it was destroyed in all, and the farmers lost that much production. And in 2021 production, the last time, our estimates, but not just an estimation, but based on published documents that we have, one of them is coming soon, maybe this week, between 50 to 80% of the production from the normal expected was lost. That is from 2021 production harvest season. And now that these farm inputs, seeds and fertilizers were not properly and timely delivered, it's going to be not different from last year. Yes, farmers have had access to their land; they could plow it, but then they don't have the selected seeds. They don't have the fertilizers to produce as much as they could. I'm not mentioning about all the destruction that has happened, but just giving you the overall image. And yes,
what you said is interesting too, because if getting seeds in is arguably easier than getting aid in to the region, and yet the seeds didn't come in, and aid is just trickling in, and so it has a compounding effect of not having enough food in the harvest seasons that follow, creating an aid-dependent society. I think that's really interesting. Can you tell us how you think that people are surviving right now without the inputs, without the tools that they need, without access to? Certainly Western Tigray is completely occupied right now, so many Tigrayans still don't have access to their lands, but how are the people surviving from what you're able to see?
It's all part of the war strategy, but it would be difficult for me to believe that people are surviving. And I mean, we are saying about 500,000 people might have possibly died. That is an estimation from March, and how many months have gone since. And that number of 500,000 by itself is not an easy number. And if we are losing that much in that so much time, and how could we say that people are surviving and when they are falling like leaves like that? But then again, I mean, we have something to proudly say that our society is a resilient society, and they adjust to whatever change they have. Well, of course, that's not a thing to be proud of, because you cannot be proud of you being resistant to hardships. Right. Yes, they are trying to do their best to resist and to cope with it, but I wouldn't call this survival.
Right. And we've already missed the planting season, right? That was June and July. So if seeds were to come in now, would it be beneficial?
From what we see, with the limited information we get image, and from that, and also the information we get from the aid agencies, we see that much of the land is now planted. We are now in August already, and of course, the planting season starts in June, but the land is now planted. Most of it is planted, except some pocket areas that are possibly to be planted with turf. but the selected seed and fertilizer has not been delivered on time. It's only last 1 or 2 weeks that aid agencies are saying they have been able to deliver fertilizer and seed. But for when? Fertilizer that is supposed to be delivered early enough. Well, I have personally worked for the Bureau of Agriculture at all levels, including at Kabale, Woreda, and regional level. And the time we used to distribute fertilizer and seed was early in May and June. By early June, you have to distribute it to the farmers. It has to reach in the hand of the farmers, so that the farmer could plan when to plow, what to plant, and when to do this and that. But then aid agencies are now telling us in August that they have delivered fertilizer. That's a joke for me personally.
It's too late. It's too late. We already missed the planting season. Wow. So to piggyback off of this conversation, I want to, we all know what genocide is. It's the intent to destroy in whole or in part a nation or ethnic group. The Ethiopian government has been accused of outright genocide and acts of genocide and so on. But I've heard you talk about a term that's less used, and it's ecocide. Can you tell us what ecocide is? I think it's really interesting and relevant to the story of Tigray. How has that played out? How has that played out in Tigray in this most recent war?
Yes. Ecocide is again, as it is for genocide, it's also a wanton, unlawful destruction of the natural environment, which includes the forest and the soil, and the water, and all that. And if we just mention the natural environment, just the forest, how has that been destroyed? It has been destroyed. I would summarize it in 3 ways. One is that we have had a successful story of land restoration policies in Tigray, for which Tigray has also won a global award for land restoration policy. And the land restoration activities has been interrupted over the last 3 years, at first because of COVID, and the last 2 years because of the war. So this land restoration activities has been interrupted. That's one. And the other one is the war itself. Almost all over Tigray, there has been conflict incidents in almost all over Tigray, and it's not only using simple bullets. We've had these heavy artilleries where they burn an entire landscape. You might have come across some image where Professor Kundeya posts on his Twitter account, and I had tried to geolocate one of them into west of Shire, that's in Asgede, and in a particular area called Hezaz, and he only posted one landscape, one hill. But then I had to look at georeference and look at what happened around it, and I could digitize about 225 hectares burned because of the fighting in one area in a single village called Hezaz. And you can imagine what happens in other parts of Tigray as well. And the other one is when you don't have electricity and fuel, people would need an alternative energy source to produce food, for making light and all that, and making food and all that. So when you don't have electricity and fuel, then you need an option, and people would shift into firewood and charcoal. And where are they going to get this? Of course, they are going to deforest the forest around them, to cut the forest around them. And in many areas, you find hills where they used to be full of eucalyptus and other forests or other plants before the war started. And a month after, or maybe 2 or 3 months after, you find them cleared out. And many hills. I have, for instance, looked at a hill around Adaghams in an area called Kumasabaha, where a hill is now totally empty. And if you look at the entire Tigray, many places would be like that. So that's not an easy thing. And it's equally important, the genocide, to me. And why is it equally important? Where is Tigray located? Were we trying to introduce this land restoration policy, for instance? So Tigray is located in 3 directions, located in desert area. In the west, we have the Sahara Desert, you have the Sahel Desert, and in the east, you have Afar, which is one of the hostile environments on Earth. And in the north, of course, Eritrea is part of northwestern part of Eritrea. Most of it is part of the Sahel Desert. So we are in between this, and we are encircled between desert areas. And it's the land restoration policies were aimed at stopping the desertification. But then if this process continues, if the ongoing ecocide continues, then it's inevitable that we are going to have it being part of a desert.
Wow.
Then this would mean, well, a genocide is a risk of being exterminated now. But if you have an ecocide, then it would mean any future generation who could survive the genocide would be exterminated by an ecocide, because the environment would be inhabitable anyway. People would flee and dislocate themselves anyway. So I think it's equally important. The impacts are not directly visible for now, but then in the long run, it will be visible by itself, and people would not be able to survive in the same spot by itself. It will be inhabitable for humans to survive.
Wow. You said ecocide is the extermination of future generations. That's a powerful statement, really powerful, something for us to really think about and chew on. You know, I was really impressed. I remember in 2000 driving through Tigray, and the deforestation was really obvious. And over the years, because I used to travel every year, all of my family is there, my grandmother and extended family, and I would travel pretty much every year to go and visit them. And I watched as the reforestation efforts were greening Tigray again. It was really beautiful. So to hear now that entire forests are being cleared because people have no access and they need energy somehow, is really devastating. I think you're right. That's something we're not paying enough attention to. And ecocide is the extermination of future generations. What a powerful statement. I heard an activist who was in Tigray and now I believe he's in Addis Ababa. He was talking about the health concerns in the state of Tigray because of this environmental destruction. And he was saying things like the streets are dirty. This is a direct translation from Tigrinya, doesn't really translate well, but essentially he was saying all of these issues of not having clean water, all of the issues of not having health and sanitation goods is leading to preventable diseases, things like cholera, and just widespread disease in general related to these kind of health conditions. What can be done to control that right now? Because there's still no running water in the state of Tigray until electricity is restored. We won't have any running water. There are no goods coming into the state in terms of health and sanitation goods. So what can the people do, or what are you aware of, if anything, that's being done to control some of those communicable diseases?
Yes, well, this is still part of the war strategy, I would say. It's like finding all possible ways in which the people could perish, could go into a non-existence level. Starve them, kill them, leave them there locked so that they perish on their own. So if the people are starving whereby their immune system is destroyed and you don't have the healthcare facilities, and for instance, if you see in the urban areas whereby we have the facility, the water facilities, for instance, where they were supposed to be maintained in a regular or semi-regular basis, and that would not be happening because you don't have the public servant, the employees there to work, and the maintenance service would not be there, and the hygiene and all that would be at its lowest basis, and that would make a favorable condition for simple sickness, simple disease to flourish, and it would be a challenging situation for the people, understandably. And I think the best thing we could do, I know it would be, I believe it's being done, but not in a sufficient way, and the situation is also not enabling to do that. But the best thing we could do is that have it documented, try to have studies about this, and provide early warning services to the society. Try to educate them the easiest things they can do on their own. Plus, let the international community know about it, so that at least they are aware of it.
Absolutely. Many of us, speaking of the international community, have been just appalled at how slow the world has been to respond, and how they've even when the world does respond and creates, investigative groups that are going into Tigray, how the Ethiopian government, someone who's accused, a state that is accused of many of these crimes, is so intertwined in the investigations. In simplistic terms, it's like a robber who robbed a home being the one who then goes and interviews the homeowner. I mean, it's bizarre. But we've had two joint investigations. There was the investigation in August of 2021, and now the most recent group that went into Ethiopia and into Tigray. They had a 1-year mandate to investigate. Of course, the Ethiopian government tried to block the establishment of that commission and then tried to stop the funding, block the funding unsuccessfully. But they just returned after a really controlled visit. What are some of the criticisms are that they didn't go anywhere in Tigray. They didn't get access to any of the places that were relevant for investigation. What are your thoughts on how any of the investigations have gone, if you can call them true investigations? What stands out to you as someone who has documented so much of what's happened and has a deep understanding of at least the crimes that we're able to gather information on? I'm sure there's many more that we don't have information on, but what is your response to the so-called investigations that have happened?
I may have a lot to say, but the least I can say about it is, if I have to start from the previous investigation, for instance, by the time we have had about 260 massacres documented, the time they went to Tigray to investigate, that is the so-called joint investigation. But they only visited 9 of them, imagine, and whatever reports they might have produced is based on this their visit to 9 spots out of this 260 massacre incidents, imagine. And not only that, but the involvement of the Ethiopian regime by itself is allowing the criminal itself in investigating his crime, and which is giving him a chance, awarding him a chance to whitewash his wrongdoings. And what is in common for both, for this one and that the previous investigation, is that even now, any investigation, not only the investigation, but also the way the humanitarian organizations are working, is that they only abide the rules, the restrictions that are given by the Ethiopian government. That is, for me personally, that is a de facto support. They are abiding by, agreeing by the restrictions that is given by the criminals themselves. Then how is it an investigation? If we are to call it an investigation, yes, it has to be independent. Yes, for now we have only the UN-led investigation that is recently established, but it has to be fully independent and moving based on its own terms of reference, not by the terms of reference that are issued by the criminal, which is the Ethiopian government. And the other thing I would say is, if it is an investigation of the and about giving justice to the victims, then it has to investigate it has to be a full and open investigation to what has happened there. And we say that the information we have so far is limited. It's only the tip of the iceberg because of the limitations in communication. But
Absolutely.
whatever planned investigation now is also happening without lifting this blockade. So they are not having an open access to the area, to the victims, and not even contacting the victims. They have only returned from Addis. And how are we going to call it an investigation, an independent investigation?
Agreed. One of the more shocking things, it kind of makes you question how serious these investigators are, is when they made a call for submissions of crimes, and they said, please, upload your crimes or send your information or data or evidence of crimes, and just the irony of that when Tigray is under a complete blockade. How would they submit evidence? They have no access to internet. They have no access to phones. It was it would be funny if it wasn't so serious, Wow. So, Emnet, I want to thank you, first of all. Thank you for all the work you're doing. Thank you for all of the information. You're just a wealth of knowledge and have been able to do what, frankly, no one else has been able to do in terms of quantifying what's happening on the ground. It's a huge contribution and helps us at least have a starting point. Certainly not enough. And we need to dig deeper, but it certainly gives us a starting point. I would love for you to give your closing remarks, and also if you can just, in your opinion, based on everything that you know, tell us what is the most important thing that can happen today to save lives in Tigray. I mean, clearly, you know, the seeds arrived a day too late, and of course that's by design. That was not by accident. So what can be done now today that can help save lives in Tigray, and just your closing remarks overall on mapping the war on Tigray and your experience to date.
Thank you, Melita. The last thing I would say is the most important thing here is to save lives as much as possible. And if we have to save lives, then the first thing that has to happen is the siege needs to be lifted as soon as possible, at the earliest possible. So then once the siege is lifted, then food needs to be fully delivered, medical care and all that, and the communication and everything. And so that we fully know what is really happening on the ground. And based on that, we could deliver whatever is needed, is necessary to save lives there. And justice needs to be served so that we could see reconciliation among the people. And the most important thing I see here is, again, we need to identify what is lacking for us as a people and as a diaspora and as a government also, and the international community also needs to look at what is missing there in Tigray and what lessons can be taken for the rest of the world. It's a big lesson from which the international community would also learn. And if you don't do things that you are supposed to do now in Tigray, then how would you be able, how are you going to have the moral of saying or doing something else somewhere else? So it's a lesson for everyone that we must learn, and it should be about saving lives, which is very urgent.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Emnet Negash. He has successfully quantified the toll of the genocide in Tigray, at least as a starting point, the tip of the iceberg, using evidence. And we've been dealing with so much anecdotally and trying to get testimony from people that it's sad but powerful to get the actual numbers behind some of the devastation. You have the best information to date in terms of the crimes that have been committed against Tigrayans in Tigray. So we will be in touch. We hope to have you back again. Thank you for all of your work. And hopefully this is a call to the international community of the urgency in terms of needing a resolution. And at the very least, the political solution is going to take time, but we have to figure out how to decouple these conversations about humanitarian aid and saving lives and politics. So thank you so much for your time today, Emnet.
Thank you for having me, Melita.